We got some new legendaries, including the new version of Alexstrasza. You won't want to miss this one.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
Yeah, we get some pretty cool cards in this one, but before I get into it, I just want to remind you guys to come hang out on Twitch with me sometime. We talk about all these new cards live. You can ask me questions, you can argue with me, you can tell me how stupid I am, and I have to listen, and I talk through it with you. There are links to my Twitch channel in the description and in the pinned comment below. I hope you'll stop by. Probably live right now. If not, drop a follow. We'll see each other soon. That said, let's talk about Dragon Queen Alexstrasza because she's a new neutral legendary minion. Super cool to see a new version of Alex, one of my favorite all time and my first ever legendary card in Hearthstone. This one also a 9 mana 8/8, of course a dragon, and the battle cry reads, if your deck has no duplicates, so we've got another Reno / Zephyrus style card here, add 2 random dragons to your hand, and those dragons cost 0. So you've got yourself here a nice late game bomb style dragon, as I think all dragons should be, where presumably you're going to be able to dump 3 fairly large minions onto the board. Most dragons are big. There's a lot of 8/8s in the pool, some 12/12s, some 4/12s, some really positive effects too. You could get like a Calicos and a Ysera, and then you follow it up with another big spell because you got a Calicos for 0 mana. So you're just going to dump the board full of stuff. And I think any kind of late game control deck, obviously some kind of Zephyrus or Reno version, they tend to run a little more mid-rangey, which this might be fine in as well, is going to be happy to play this because it's just going to load up the board. It's going to create value. You might be able to find some defensive tools out of it as well. Might be getting some taunt dragons, for instance. We've already seen 1 or 2 of those. So I think this card makes a lot of sense in a variety of different decks. It's just good at filling up the board. It's occasionally going to be great at generating value. I guess theoretically you could chain this into multiple Alexstrazzas and just get a giant board of Dragon Queen Alexstrazzas that they just keep creating new versions that cost 0. That would be pretty insane to see. I'm looking forward to that highlight, assuming it is possible, which it should be, but sometimes Blizzard codes that stuff out. But nonetheless, just a really solid late game bomb that tons of decks can use, I think. The fact that these cost 0, making them instant, is really the only reason this is good. Of course, if it just gave you random dragons, that would be terrible, but going big on the board with this one's going to feel fantastic. So, yes, another great Zephyrus option. Not every Zephyrus deck will want to run this because some super aggressive ones won't, but anything that's mid-range or control-oriented can definitely make room for this card. I think it's very, very good. All right, next up here we have Dragon's Chinvala, a new Mage legendary card. It is a 3 mana 2/5 elemental that reads, after you cast 3 spells in a turn, summon a 5/5 elemental. So that will sound really familiar to you if you remember the Priest legendary weapon from Kobolds and Catacombs, Dragon Soul. It worked exactly the same way, except it summoned you 5/5 dragons, and it was a weapon instead of a minion. Now, that card, to be frank, kind of sucked. It was almost impossible to get that to work well. I know you had this crazy special deck that nobody else knew about that made it successful, but for the rest of us, we couldn't get it to work. And I'm a little bit worried Chinvala is going to suffer the same fate. Now, I will say a few things. First off, in Mage, it's much, much easier to cast multiple spells. We have Sorcerer's Apprentice, which makes spells cheap. There are things like Magic Trick that allows you to cycle into multiple spells with a Sorcerer's Apprentice very easily. And then there are cards like Mana Cyclone to make that a viable game plan so that you don't just completely run out of gas. It can refill your hand and even help you get off more Ray of Frosts and so on and so forth. So yes, I can envision board states where this actually works in Mage, unlike in Priest, where you didn't have that quite as much refill potential outside of like exactly a Lyra and Radiant Elemental stuff. It required like 3 or 4 cards to work, and it was still susceptible to weapon removal. Chinvala, on the other hand, is a slightly sticky minion at 5 health for 3 mana, but keep in mind that if you do play this on turn 3, for instance, it has to live into a future turn to work well, or you could maybe combo this out for 5 mana with an Apprentice and try to go crazy. But the issue is it just takes 3 or 4 cards to get that engine going. And you have to have exactly those 3 or 4 cards. And I'm worried this doesn't have that upside necessary to make it worth it. Like, yes, you may get a 5/5 or, best case scenario, maybe 2 5/5s. But is that really going to be enough? Does that still just die to, Oasis Surgers from Druid? Does that just get brawled away as soon as it happens? And then you've invested a lot into a play that really wasn't that big of a payoff. So in other words, like say Flame Wakers, for instance, they are a card that rewards a similar sort of behavior. The more spells you cast, the more stuff you get, but you can remove your opponent's board if you want to. You can do a ton of face damage in a single turn. You can do things that kind of add up. There's an incremental advantage to those things. There's more value returned. Whereas Chinvala puts you in a passive state. It puts you on the back foot, gives your opponent the necessary means to, or at least the opportunity to remove stuff. So it's not as driven and it's not as direct as some of those other kind of spell synergy things we've seen Mage do in the past. And Flamewaker's been in standard format right now with that same package, and it's still not a competitively viable deck. It's a very low tier deck right now. So I don't see how Chinvala is better than a Flamewaker. I think it's a little better than Dragon Soul, sure, but Dragon Soul wasn't very good. So to me, you might get a couple 5/5 elementals, but in this current scheme of Hearthstone, I just don't think that's big enough, fast enough, or strong enough. I think Chinvala, unfortunately, looks like a little bit of a whiff. I've got some tiny ray of hope there, but ultimately I think this card's going to fall short. Next up here, let's take a look at a card whose name we don't really know yet. This one was sort of leaked, I guess. I don't know the full details, but translations aren't out for this yet in English as far as its name, but we're sure about the effects and stats. So this is some unknown dragon, warrior dragon we'll call it. It's a 3-mana 3/2 with Rush and a Battle Cry. If you've invoked twice, summon 2 copies of this minion. So at its base, this is honestly kind of a decent minion, right? This is a little bit comparable to a card like Rabid Worgen that's a 3/3 with Rush. The fact that it's a 3/2 doesn't usually change a lot in the early game. That 3/3 is going to die in many cases. It can't quite value trade over a 2/3, but nonetheless, usually you want to trade those up anyway, and this retains that ability, but when you invoke, suddenly you get 3 of these, which makes it significantly better than a card like Restless Mummy, which Restless Mummy is an amazing card. You get 3, and they have more stats, technically. And then you can do things like in a Galakron deck, if Galakron draws this minion, as is its effect in Warrior, and it buffs it, it will then be a 7/6 minion, and it'll be copies, so you'll get 3 7/6s with Rush immediately after playing Galakron, and that is a 10-mana play, so you could do them instantly if you had 10 mana when you played your Galakron. That is just absurd. Now, I will note that it's pretty unlikely in most cases you will have invoked twice already on curve by turn 3. It might technically be impossible. I didn't look at all the invoke cards, or at least impossible based on how we know it right now. But at the very least, I think it's unlikely just to have drawn the right stuff and have low enough mana cost ones. So I don't think this is normally going to be an on-curve sort of play, but even if you played this like on turn 5 with a hero power, you'd still be pretty pumped because that would be a sick 5-mana play, getting 3 of these even at their base level. And then when you include any other sort of shenanigans, they just get better and better, like that Galakron scenario. So yes, this minion seems to have a ton of upside. Of course, it bears the risk, as do all units in Galakron decks, that if the Galakron deck doesn't get there, if the invokes don't make sense, then this card just won't work. So the likelihood for it to be played is kind of shaky, but certainly the power level or the impact, if it's played, is going to be high. It's going to be a high power sort of card. I will say I think the Galakron Warrior kind of contributes more to an aggro game plan, and this is a little bit more mid-rangey, or in some cases even control-oriented, because it's normally going to be trading into stuff if you're happy, but even an aggro deck is really happy to summon 3 3/2s for 3 mana. That just presents a lot of aggressive stats on board, regardless if they're rushing into anything or not. So I think this still does kind of fit the game plan. Next up here we have Dragon Breeder, a new 2-mana 2/3 neutral card with Battle Cry. Choose a friendly dragon and add a copy of it to your hand. So this is basically a Zola the Gorgon style card, but coming in a little bit cheaper and specifically limited to dragons. Now, Zola was fantastic. It turns out adding copies of stuff to your hand that affordably at 3 mana was a really good play, and she saw all kinds of play across a variety of different decks in her era. And I think Dragon Breeder is going to lend itself towards the same sort of success, but just specifically with any kind of dragon card that matters. These are copies, not bounce effects, and that goes a long way. You don't have to take the stats out of play. So, just copying a big, crazy, threatening 8-mana dragon and replaying it might be really nice. You do kind of have to have stuff on board, or at least be able to combo out in a single turn to make this card successful, but I don't think that'll be challenging. It's 2 mana, so it's not going to be hard. And then if you look at things like the new Priest Dragon that discounts cards in your hand, it's going to be nuts with this thing. Play the discount, your Dragon Breeder gets discounted, you copy that discount card, you replay it again, you set up crazy combo shenanigans, etc. That's just like one example, and if you run through the list of dragons in the game, you'll certainly find others as well that can both generate resources, set up crazy plays, just go for tempo on board with as much stat value and aggression as you can. All of that's possible with a card like Dragon Breeder. So yes, I absolutely think this card will see some success. There's obviously going to be at least 1 or 2 decks running good dragons that make the cut, and Dragon Breeder has a good chance to see play in those decks as long as they are perhaps more mid to late game or combo oriented. I don't think this makes as much sense in a purely aggressive deck, and I don't think dragons tend to lend themselves towards aggression either, but nonetheless, a card with a lot of upside and a lot of playability. So next up here we have the Chromatic Egg, a 5-mana 0/5 neutral minion. It has a battle cry that secretly discovers a dragon to hatch into, and then the death rattle hatches. So this is basically like Mechano Egg, but instead of getting a consistent 8/8, you're going to get some dragon of your choosing based on 3 random dragons. And in most cases, that's going to be a pretty big dragon. If you look across the dragon pool, they're far often much larger, more late game, high cost units that are, 8/8s, 4/12s. Those are the most common dragon stat lines. Now, I'm sure there will be some lower cost, lower stat dragons introduced in Descent of Dragons, but it would be really, really hard to pick 3 random dragons and not get at least one that was pretty meaty from a stat line standpoint. Probably at least like a 4/4 or a 4/5 could be like your worst case scenario. And, often you're going to get that 8/8 or 12/12 stat line as well. But nonetheless, the secretly discovered aspect here, I don't think is really all that significant. Your opponent is going to kind of expect the worst no matter what. They're going to expect a 12/12 in there and address and react to this thing like there's a 12/12 in there. And if you only have a 4/4 in there, it's not like it really helps you that much, right? Like they just kind of leave this on board. So although there are always like shenanigans possible with cards like this, things like Death Rattle Rogue might be able to just create tons of big dragons. There's always plays and possibilities for cards like that. I still think there are just cards that are more consistent, more reliable. You know what you're going to get. So the secret aspect here doesn't matter. The inconsistency goes against this card quite a bit, and it doesn't have any other like onboard synergies. Like Mechano Egg is great because you can magnetize to it. Chromatic Egg lacks some of that play. So for me, this one just looks like it's going to fall a little short. The consistency problems are going to overwhelm any kind of cool upside that the secret aspect might employ. Although, I think it's really cool design. I love this idea of secret stuff. I wish we saw more of this in Hearthstone. So this might not be the card to get there from a playability standpoint, but still a really, really neat and fun and cleverly worded card. Dragon Queen Alexstrasza is a 4-star card. Dragon Shinvala is a 2-star card. Is a 4-star card. Chromatic Egg is a 2-star card. Dragon Breeder is a 4-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for part 7, I think we're on, of the Descent of Dragons card review. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me why I'm wrong about Shinvala. I hope I am. I want all cards to be playable and interesting and cool, so convince me. But until then, thanks much for watching, and until next time, game on.